This time we'll be looking at the workflow inside of Stable Projectorz, which will consist of 4 stages. In the first one, we'll project the textures from different angles onto our object at once to make sure that most of it is textured. In the second step, we'll remove the seams between those textures. Third stage is where we patch up any remaining bits that we missed with the inpaint brush. And finally, we're going to add details using the Background-Inpaint diffusing technique. Before we can do so, let's have a look at the interface. I'm going to double click in here to expand the window and make it easier to work with. There are 2 panels and one main view window where the 3D model is. Here we're telling the neural network what we want to see, for example a dungeon door. Here, something we don't want to see, low quality, low resolution, smudge, blur, and so on. The actual neural network that will be generating our images is to be picked from here. I only have one. Be careful because they'll affect the visual quality of your generation. There are some for cartoony images and some networks for realistic. Variational autoencoder is like a filter that can affect the saturation and the juiciness of your colors, but usually you want to keep it as none. If you're getting pale colors, consider getting the VAE and using a custom one here. However, once again, none works more or less okay most of the time. This is the algorithm that will be used to extract your image from the white noise. There are faster ones or higher quality ones, more stable or less stable ones, which jump between different variants more often, but this one is good. Here is how many times you want the network to think about when generating your image in increments. 10 increments is good for testing out and 20 is good for final results. The width and height is how many pixels do you want to allocate for each projection inside of the main view window. Here is how many images you want to create at once, for example 3 images at a time, and here's how many times you want to create it. So for example, doing it 4 times, 3 images at a time is going to give you 12 images. If your GPU is weak, do a single image every single time, but just increase the number of repetitions like so. Otherwise, do something like 2 or maybe 4 images and fewer iterations. This is how much you want the network to be forced to listen to the text. To make it more creative, just reduce the CFG scale, but it might deviate from the text. And if you make it like 8 or 10, you will start to force the network to listen more and more to the text prompt, which might be constraining it too much, might produce you weird results. This was the input panel and it will always remain the same, but then there is this panel here, which will change depending on what you pick in these buttons. So in the 3D Objects tab, you can load your model, FBX or OBJ, and you can filter down to specific meshes if you want to work with them separately. Hold Ctrl and select more of them, or just click this All button to pick all of the meshes and make them visible again. And lastly, in the control nets is where you enable your networks that control the generation. So you can click here and enable one of them. By default, we want to have at least one depth control net. Here is the control neural network. We can pick between depth, or in my case, I also have normal by, but the depth expects as an input a black and white image. So the control net unit will help StableDiffusion to figure out where exactly to generate the art. For example, if I move my object somewhere here and request dungeon door to be created, the control net unit, this thing specifically, is what will help StableDiffusion to generate in the top left corner and not somewhere else. So for the depth control net, we want to submit a black and white image which represents the distance away from the camera. Rotating like so, you can see that anything that's white is considered to be closer to the camera, anything that's darker is further away from us. So it's like a depth estimation. But if you're using a different control neural network, you can pick, for example, normal by, but in this case, the normal control network will expect the normals to be submitted. So right-click on the preview image and pick normals to be sent into it, because it won't work with the black and white representation. We want to be using depth, so let's do depth, and submitted the depth image. And notice that for the depth, we don't want to do any kind of pre-processing, because the depth that we are sending is already perfect in itself. So keep it as none, depth, black and white image. Let's zoom up as close as we can, maybe from this angle, and specify in the prompt that we want to have a masterpiece 1.3 because we want this keyword to really stand out from the remainder of the text, and do a scary dungeon entrance, dungeon door, beautiful art, smooth stone, highly detailed game asset. For the negative stuff, let's put mediocre sketch, smudge, blur, low quality, low resolution, and let's do boring. Don't overdo it because you might constrain the network and it will be afraid of doing things, but this is reasonable and good. Whatever you put at the front of your text is going to have more attention and be more important, But you can always surround your keywords with weight like this by putting a colon and specifying the weight. 512 by 512. And let's hit generate art with maybe 2 images at a time or 3 images twice. It tells you the current progress as well as how many modals are currently loaded. There is one base modal, which is your main neural network specified here, and also one control net, which is the neural network that's forcing the generation into a specific region of the screen. It also tells you how much GPU memory is being used, and if you're close to hitting your GPU memory limit, and the time it takes to generate. For example, in my case, 23 seconds for everything. Let's move this away and go into the Arts tab and pick between different variants that it gives us. So I'm gonna click this button to remove the wireframe, and you can right-click any icon and adjust the blending, like so, and the softness, how far it extends, using these sliders. Or remove the blending completely by making them 0. If you've been playing around with sliders, these ones for example, or somewhere here, you can always right-click them, which is gonna restore their default values. So if you forgot what it was, simply right-click here, and it will come to the default value. So this generation right here gave us 6 images, and we can only pick one single image from the entire generation. So let's do something interesting that doesn't have much lighting. Let's do this one. And I'm gonna rotate around and do a similar generation here. Also 3 images twice. Middle mouse button allows you to pan around. The Alt and left mouse drag for orbiting, it's very important. Scroll wheel to move in and out, as well as holding Alt and right mouse dragging allows you to do it smoother. And if your model has disappeared and you lost it, simply press F on your keyboard and it will focus. Lastly, you can move around by holding the right mouse button, like in the FPS game, and using WASD keys on your keyboard, as well as Q and E. So I have 6 new images. I can once again control how far the blending extends in case if there's something beneath there already. But right now I'm going to disable this and make it completely visible and make a decision of which one to keep by looking at both sides at once. So I want it to be similar to what's already at the front, and I'm going to try to find any generation that suits me. I would say this can suit me, except that I might need to tweak the hue and the saturation to fit me slightly better. We have quite a few images, and we can only pick one from each generation. I like this one and this one, so I'm going to remove the remaining ones by clicking this bucket tool, and just keep those 2. Now we are ready to look at the workflow, so I'm going to get rid of the images by deleting them, and do the first step, which is the multi-view projection. Let's increase the number of cameras to something like 4. I'm going to enable the wireframe once again, and click the sorting button to arrange the cameras around. Using middle mouse button, I can pan around and position them like so, scroll wheel to zoom in and out, and Alt left mouse button to drag around, because I want to have the front, the back, and I can press Ctrl while orbiting to snap to the nearest 90 degrees if necessary. Like this, the back, the front, and then the sides. So let's do this side and another side, which is going to be this. I want to zoom up as much as possible, but to avoid overlapping like this, make sure that I'm covering as many pixels as possible, not to waste any projection that's going to be landing on this object. Before we do the generation, let's enhance the negative prompt slightly. In here, I'm going to put in the brackets variance, multiple choices, different colors, comma, strong lighting with harsh shadows, colon 1.2, because I want to make everything here really standing out from the remainder of the negative keywords. The reason why I'm using the variance and multiple choice is because when StableDiffusion receives those silhouettes, it might think that the user wants to have different variants, like maybe a red door, a wooden door, a metallic door, and so on. We want them to be the same, so we're using variance in the negative prompt. We don't want variation. We want it to be as similar as possible. And we also want to exclude the lighting and the shadows, because we want to apply those later on in the game engine and so on. And since we have 4 different doors, we want to increase the width and height to something like 1024 by 1024. Each one will be receiving a quarter of the image. So 512 by 512 per each camera, and 1024 in total. So let's do 6 images and hit Generate Art. In the Arts tab, we can see that 6 images are being prepared. and it might take slightly longer time because the resolution has been increased. So the black window shows us the progress, the memory, and if you want to speed it up by a little bit, you can always click this little toggle here that you might not see very well, but it's there, which is going to reduce the FPS down to 5 frames per second and reduce the preview quality. This will help the black window to get more resources, and it might complete by about 20% faster. Otherwise, just keep it untoggled, which allows you to work in the meantime by brushing the objects, masking them, and so on. I can tell you the keywords are really working because the different sides of the door already look the same, which is exactly what we want. But I just noticed that I might have overdone the CFG scale and probably should have kept it as 7. But the outcome looks more or less okay. I'm going to untoggle the wireframe and make a choice about what I'm going to keep using. I have to decide based on how similar the front and the back is because I want the door to make sense. Well, I can tell you that this one looks quite good to me. So I like this one. I can keep the rest, or I can just click on the bucket tool and destroy anything else. This releases the GPU memory and makes it easier for your GPU. So we've just done step number 1, which is casting several textures from different directions, and we are ready to advance to the second step out of 4. Here we'll make sure that our projections land nicely by removing seams between them. We have 4 cameras, this one for the front, for the back, and 2 sides. There are 4 in total, and I'm going to click on one of the numbers to enter the edit mode. I can also enter it by clicking this button, or untoggle it to return back into the camera's placement mode. So if I zoom up here, you can see that there are certain issues happening because different projections are being landed in the same spot. To begin with, I can right-click my icon and use this soft slider to adjust the initial blending to help the things be blended together slightly better. For example, I can see an effect happening here. So I'd say initial softness of about that much can be beneficial. Once the initial softness has been set, you can start to adjust it by brushing. And we can currently see that because I have 4 cameras, there are 4 toggles in here. Right now I'm on camera number 1. So I can increase the brush size to something like that. And with a white color, just have a look at where the camera is projecting and what it wants to do. So we can see camera number 1 is really wanting to shine from this direction outwards, and it quickly creates this blackness and blue color, which we don't want to have. So we have to be careful about this, but in other locations, camera number 1 can be very beneficial since it can help us to remove these issues here. I left click and drag to paint it with white color and fully accept camera number 1. And I can also see that if I hover my mouse, number 1 can offer us a good outcome in here. So a couple of taps with a white brush to accept it in there. And also here, just a few taps. Let's see, the blending happens here. We have to watch out not to overdo it, otherwise we're quickly gonna expose the blue color. So let's see what else is offered to us. Here everything is good. Maybe in here, just a few minor adjustments. And if I increase the brush size, I can see that there is camera number 2, which doesn't work here at all. Number 3, which is mostly for casting it from this direction, but it can be helpful in this particular case right here. So with camera number 3, I'm gonna do a couple of taps to lay it lightly, but 100% strength might be too much. So I'm gonna press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on my keyboard, 5 in this case, to make it 50%. So with 50% strength or even 30, so 3 on my keyboard, I'm going to switch back to camera number 1 and do a couple of touches here to make it more soft transition, so it's not as abrupt. So you can control the opacity of your brush. And just looking here, there is a minor thing that I might want to tweak with the camera number 1, a couple of taps with a 30% strength and solve any issues in here. Continuing to look around, there is one problem here, but it can be solved by using camera number 1 by tapping a few times. And also camera number 1 can be beneficial in this location. So doing a couple of taps to apply it fully in here. And also here. Looking around, let's see, maybe another camera could be beneficial. Number 2 doesn't work here. Number 3, number 4. Okay, so it's number 4 and number 1, which we can use to make a decision. But instead of moving your mouse up and down like so, I strongly encourage you to use just F1, F2, F3 keyboard shortcuts, because those will quickly allow you to change the cameras and it's very convenient. You can keep your mouse here and simply use F1, F2 to change between different cameras. So F1, F4, I can see that the fourth camera is very beneficial here. I'm gonna apply it a few times. Maybe increase the strength to about 100%, so 0 on my keyboard, and make sure that it's fully applied. And also here. This way you can go over your object and make sure that the blending works just as you want and nothing weird is happening. Here perhaps 40% opacity would make more sense and be more gentle. So I can see camera number 4 works good, but only up to this location. Afterwards it starts to create blue color, which I don't want. And I have to be careful because if I were to click a couple of times here, I'm going to add the blackness from the camera number 4. So I have to watch out for this. If I did, I can just use camera number 1, so F1, and have a look at what the camera number 1 offers me here, using the white brush color. Be careful because if you're adjusting your things, you might be on the camera number 1, and you might have some kind of preview, but if you try to paint it in here, so no matter how much I try to paint, nothing is changing, that is because camera number 1 is strictly for this direction. I can confirm this by making the brush size gigantic and see that indeed camera number 1 is shining from this direction and only is concerned about this part of the surface. If I try to paint from here, it won't be listening to me. Even if I try to erase with a black brush, nothing will happen. So I have to be mindful about which camera I'm looking through and keep increasing my brush size to have a better peek. Maybe let's have a look here as well. So F1, F2, F3 and F4. And I have to be careful about using the white brush because I want to increase the contribution. Camera number 1, if I increase its contribution using the white brush, it looks good. So I'm gonna tap a couple of times here to remove that ugly black color from here. And let's do here. I can always zoom in to get a better look. And like this, you can remove your seams, which is basically the second step of our workflow. Now we're ready to advance to the third step, which is patching up any surfaces that we missed. Let's go into the screen mask, because we want to be doing inpainting now, and you can always press Tab on your keyboard, so you don't have to constantly move your mouse here. Increase your brush size, so Shift right mouse drag, and lay an orange stroke like this. You can already see that it automatically activated the inpaint mode and added extra controls. We want to be doing latent nothing so that it generates the stuff inside the orange brush stroke without knowing what used to be there inside. So it's latent nothing. And we want it to do 100% generation inside of it, so it doesn't retain anything that used to be there before. Let's reduce the width and the height down to maybe something like 768 by 768. Let's just quickly paint it once again and hit Generate Art. This will create 6 images, which we can preview in the Arts tab once again. And while the generation is happening, Shift right mouse drag to reduce my brush size, and with a black color, I'm going to smooth out the corners a little bit, so it fades better. Let's increase the opacity to 100, so 0 on my keyboard. And with a smaller brush size, just gonna brush it away like so. If you struggle to see where exactly the projection is landing, you can hold R on your keyboard and see where it is landing exactly. So holding R, I'm going to remove it from the door because I don't want it to be landing here at all. So with the black brush, I'm brushing it away from this location. But you can always use the softness and the far slider to help you out a little bit. Otherwise, just do it manually like I'm doing right now. And of course, you have several differences in your brush. So you can use very hard brush, which looks like this, a very soft one, and a medium one, which is on by default. If you erased too much and you want to recover, simply toggle it by using the white brush or press X, like in Photoshop, and paint it back to restore the contribution. Once it's done, you can make a decision about which one to use. In my case, I like this one, but always remember that you can right-click them and adjust the hue and the saturation so that it fits the remaining projections even better. Right-click to restore to the default values, and you can adjust the brightness and the contrast as needed. To improve the blending further, you can hold R, and maybe with a brush size of about that much, 40% strength, black brush, we can do a couple of taps here to improve the blending even further. Or in my case here, it can be helpful to actually reveal the inpaint because it can help us cover this black seam. This way you can go over your object and cover any remaining black areas, which is the third step of our workflow. Now we can advance to the last and final stage, where we have most of our object textured, but we can just add extra details to make it even more interesting. Let's quickly clean up our workspace, so I'm gonna remove any icons that are not selected, and show you one more trick, in that you can go into 3D objects, select, for example, the door mesh, and using two cameras, customize your door further and separately from the arc itself. So I'm gonna position my cameras like so, press F to focus around the camera, and F to focus here. Zoom out and Alt left mouse drag to position them in different ways, so that we have front and back. Zoom up as much as we can to cover as many pixels as possible. Maybe enable the wireframe to see slightly better what we're doing. And in here, let's generate just specifically for the door itself. I'm going to copy all of this prompt and paste it to a separate tab, just not to mess up my previous prompt. And in here, I'm going to remove the entrance, maybe an old, scary wooden dungeon door. Beautiful art, smooth stone, maybe stone we don't need, so I'm going to remove that from here. And the negative prompt is still good, because it lists variants, multiple choices, none of which we want. Since we have two different cameras, that's going to be beneficial for us. The resolution, let's do 1024 by 1024. And the batch count, let's do just 4 images in total. And the CFG scale, right-click to restore to the default 7. Then hit Generate Art. So if we jump into the Arts tab, 4 new images are being prepared. And the thing is, we've just sent this two shapes to StableDiffusion, and it doesn't have an idea that there used to be an arc made of stone around it. It literally received the black and white shape for the door. So it only saw these two things, and it now needs to make an art considering just this information. So it's generating entirely separately from the door, and can be very helpful if you had on the original art some hard shadows. For example here, beneath the arc on the door. Just isolate the door, generate the art specifically for the door itself, separate from the arc, and this way you can get rid of any kind of shadows that StableDiffusion decided to paint for you. So jump into the Arts tab, and let's see what we are offered. Untoggling the wireframe, and jumping back into the 3D objects, I'm gonna hold Control and select all of the remaining ones, or just click on the All button. Then jump into the Arts tab, and make a more informed decision about which variant to keep. So we have 4 different doors, and I like this one, for example. I can always right-click and adjust the saturation, the hue, and its darkness if needed. With this one, we can advance to the final step to add any extra details and enhance our object to make it even more interesting. For this final step, let's go into the Arts background and import a custom background. In my case, I made a tiny screenshot of a black color of this panel, which is about 36 pixels by 28, but it doesn't matter, as long as it's just black color or like dark gray, like I have here. And having this object positioned on top of it, having the background, automatically activates the so-called Background-Inpaint. We'll use this to diffuse additional details onto our object and make it more interesting. For that, we're going to do Original, and replace about 80% or maybe 75% of the original texture that we currently have. We'll add about 77% of new stuff. So Original 77, and let's adjust our prompt. The scary dungeon entrance. The variance doesn't really make much sense right now, so I'm going to copy that into a separate negative text prompt and remove the variance in multiple colors and choices. But I'm probably still going to keep the strong light because I don't want to have it applied anyway. And then for the resolution, I'm going to do something slightly lower, 768, just because in this case I'm greedy, want it to complete quicker. Zoom up as much as I can, not to waste any pixels. Maybe if I hover over here, adjust the field of view so that more of the object is visible and exposed to me, like so. Because if I were to use a higher field of view, it might be easier to work with, like it's more three-dimensional, but the surfaces are going to be less perpendicular to the camera. So orthographic modes like these are actually better if we're texturing the outside of the object, because more of the surfaces are facing the camera, and there's going to be less stretching. But for texturing the insides, the opposite is true. You want to have a field of view that is wider because you want to capture the insides of the surfaces. In my case, smaller field of view, and just position the object somewhere here. Maybe press F to focus on it. And with this and this prompt, with the black background and the original 77% imagination, let's do generate art. The created art is going to be in this panel, as usual, and we can see that we have 4 images being prepared. We can already start to tweak the far and the fading slider to reveal whatever is beneath there around the corners to make the blending slightly more acceptable, or we can just reset it by right-clicking and wait until the generation is complete. So you can see the StableDiffusion is creating additional details based on the already existing texture that is beneath there. It keeps about 23% of original and adds about 77% detail to the original. Maybe now would be a good time to adjust the far and the softness sliders, and also remember that you can always adjust the saturation and the hue if you need to make sure that your colors are fitting better each other. And of course, you can use the black brush, maybe with a 30% strength, so press 3 on the keyboard, and just fine-tune it slightly here and here to adjust the blending even better. Flick between black and white by using X on your keyboard and adjust blending as necessary. For example, here I can see that because of this angle, this issue is happening here. So with the black brush and this thing selected in red, I'm going to tap a couple of times and fix this problem here. Zoom in and repeat the process. So we currently have the black background in here, which is activating this mode automatically. Original 77% imagination, and the object is quite zoomed in. The prompt fits us, resolution is correct. Let's hit generate art, jump into the arts panel, and we have 4 new images created for us. We can adjust the fading or just keep it as original. And I can tell you straight away that from this angle, the door is probably not going to be applicable. So with a black brush, pressing 0 on keyboard to make it 100%. With a black brush, I'm going to erase the stuff from here, holding R on my keyboard to see slightly better what I'm doing. Going to dispose of it from here. And the rest seems okay. Maybe the transition is slightly too harsh in here. So we can adjust the blending using this slider, and then fine-tune it further as needed using the black and white brushes of about 50% opacity. Of course, if you want to, you can keep using the orange brush or simply press Tab and generate any missing bits. Just make sure that when you are submitting this thing, that the angle actually makes sense, because it might be a bit difficult for StableDiffusion to figure out what you mean if you position it like so. Where is the entrance? Where is the door? We cannot see it. But if you tilt it like so, then the door is suddenly visible and it will be much easier for StableDiffusion to understand where to put the stuff. So like this, we're diffusing additional details onto our already existing texture. We can always adjust the hue and saturation, use the screen mask, and keep blending the things. But I'm already happy with my result for the case of this example. Going to clean up the working space and save everything. So we can go into the save results and do export a texture, dungeon door, .png or .jpeg, or if you don't specify anything, it's going to be PNG by default. JPEG is slightly smaller, but PNG supports transparency. So dungeon door in my case. And I'm also going to use the second option, which doesn't perform any dilation, and hit save. The no dilation will have transparent background around your UV chunks, so everything here is transparent. It still has slight dilation, so it specifically helps you to avoid seams around your UV chunks, but it only has about 5 or so texels. Whereas the other variant, the standard one, performs strong dilation, so with this thing you are very unlikely to get any kind of seams, and it's going to be of a high quality. But this one doesn't have transparent background. Everything here is opaque. And lastly, before you save your textures, consider the resolution. You can control it using the plus and minus button. For example, you can do 3K or 4K and then save your texture. And also this thing controls or throttles the overall resolution for the entire project. So you can reduce it down to just 256. And you can see the preview here is of very low resolution. It's faster to work with, but the quality isn't the best. Before we wrap up for today, there is one more important thing I want to show you. And for that, I'm going to destroy all of the images from here. Going to jump into the Arts Background tab and remove it from here as well. And with my wireframe enabled, I'm going to wander away and look away from the object so that it's not visible on the screen. And I'm going to generate a background for myself. In this case, I want to do a 1024 by 768 and going to copy this away into a separate prompt somewhere here. Gonna keep the masterpiece, but replace everything else with dungeon room, smooth stones, highly detailed catacombs illustration, and then comma beautiful art. This stuff here we can keep, but maybe for the sake of the example, let's get rid of this strong lighting with hard shadows and keep everything else the same. And then generate 4 images, but this time not generate art, but generate background. And in the Art Background tab, you can see 4 images are being created, which is going to make 2-dimensional images for our background surface. Depending on what sort of aspect you select, for example, a wider one or a more square one, your results will be completely different because they will be using different sectors of your dataset. In my case, 1024 by 768 is going to result in these kind of cinematic images, and we need to keep waiting until it's over, but you can always use the low FPS toggle, as well as you can go into the control nets and actually turn off your control net, the depth one, because here we don't want any kind of object to be visible. It's just pure blackness, so we can just completely dispose of the control net unit. And when we generate next time, there's going to be just one neural network to process, not 2 of them. So jumping into the arts background, let's see what we get. Maybe it would make more sense to put into the negative prompt characters, because I don't want to see any kind of creatures visible on the images. But for now, it's fine. For the sake of the example, I'm going to keep this one, and I want to focus my door back into the view. So hovering here, pressing F to bring it into the view, I'm going to place my door somewhere where it makes sense context-wise, making sure that I have ControlNet enabled with a depth because I want to detect 3D object shape. I'll enable it with the same width and height. Going to do fewer batch counts, which is batch size of 2. And with my original prompt, which mentions the dungeon entrance, I'm going to generate art. Jumping into the arts panel, I'm gonna remove the far and the softness just to illustrate the case. Because there is this background, similar to the black custom background that we used originally, because of that there is this background in painting mode that is active and which is currently contributing to the door. So while the door is being textured right now, it looks around itself and tries to see what sort of texture to apply on it so that it's fused as best as possible into the image. Maybe let's stop the generation because I noticed that I missed one thing. I want it to be latent nothing and 100% strength imagination. I don't want to keep any kind of original color on the door because it's pure black right now. So 100% imagination without taking any guess as to what used to be on the door. Generate again, remove the far and the softness, and maybe disable the wireframe. So the outcome is already being visible. Whatever is offered onto the door is fitting very well the surrounding environment. So the backgrounds, by activating the inpaint mode, their contents will strongly affect what happens with your 3D objects. If your backgrounds have a very strong prominent light, like for example these things, your door might start to pick up on them and have glares visible on itself. So you can use the backgrounds to ensure additional consistency between your projections in addition to the multi-view projection that we did during our step 1. You can use backgrounds, but just watch out that there are no very strong bright lights. Or you can import a custom background. For example, in the arts background, just import a custom background which has everything blurred out. It will still have the tone and the saturation that you want your objects to be surrounded with, but it might have less noticeable changes in the lighting. If your backgrounds have strong light, it really becomes the part of your workflow, so you have to watch out for that. You can of course use several cameras if you want to use the multi-view projection, but as you're positioning your cameras, just make sure that it makes sense. Because if I do a door here on the ceiling, it might not fit context-wise, and StableDiffusion might not understand what you want from it. So just position it somewhere where it makes sense, like an angle here would make more sense by the door, The front of the door would be maybe more suitable for the center, but also make sure that you're utilizing as much as possible of the texture space, because you don't want to have lots of empty gaps, and you want to grab as many pixels as possible from the incoming projection. But this way, you've learned about the general workflow. First of all, we're using multiple cameras, texture everything from multiple sides. Of course, we can jump into the edit mode, toggle between different cameras using F1, F2, F3 to patch up the seams using the white brush. Then we use the orange brush to cover the missing areas and generate the art to patch things up. After using the orange brush, we can finally do the fourth step, which is diffusing additional details onto our objects, using the custom background, which can be black, for example, and using original and imagination strength of about 77. Project from several different angles, click on your art, adjust the softness, and then brush away any details to make sure that you're getting the perfect blend that you want. With this said, if you enjoy the project, you can always thank me by clicking this button. You can click here as well to learn about shortcuts, visit the website, and also join our Discord from there. People are sharing their workflow and they're really showing some awesome results. So you can share yours as well and ask questions in the channels like general, questions and bugs, and so on. And if you want any kind of features, you can drop them into the features request channel. I'm certain the tool will help you. I wish you good luck and I hope to see you soon.